Somewhere beneath the sun-bleached hills of central Turkey, there is a city that has never seen daylight. It drops more than 200 feet into solid rock, spread across at least 18 levels, though no one has ever confirmed where it truly ends. It was built to hold 20,000 people at once. And for centuries, the families living in the villages directly above it had no idea it was there. In 1963, a man in the town of Derinkuyu was renovating his basement. While knocking down an old wall, he broke through into open space on the other side. Behind that wall wasn't rock. It was a tunnel, smooth, carved, and clearly not natural. He kept digging. The tunnel led to a room. The room led to a staircase. The staircase led down into another room, and then another, and then a narrow shaft dropping even further into the dark. What he had found, without meaning to, was the entrance to one of the largest underground structures ever discovered on Earth. Today we call it the Derinkuyu underground city. And the more archaeologists have studied it, the less it looks like a simple hiding place, and the more it looks like something that shouldn't have been possible with the tools available at the time it was supposedly built. This is the story of a city built entirely underground, the mystery of who really carved it, and the darker question of exactly what, or who, they were hiding from. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics here don't add up cleanly. Cappadocia sits in central Turkey, in a region shaped by ancient volcanic eruptions. Millions of years ago, eruptions from nearby volcanoes covered the landscape in layers of ash that hardened into a soft rock called tuff. Tuff is unusual. It's soft enough to carve with simple hand tools, but once it's exposed to air, it hardens over time. This is the reason Cappadocia is famous for its fairy chimney rock formations above ground. But it's also the reason the ground underneath was so easy to carve is not the same as easy to design. And design is where Derinkuyu stops making sense. The city has at least 18 distinct levels, though ground-penetrating surveys suggest there may be more that remain sealed or collapsed. On these levels, archaeologists have mapped stables for livestock, wine and olive presses, communal kitchens with blackened ceilings from centuries of smoke, storage rooms for grain, schools, chapels carved with cross-shaped ceilings, and what appears to be a large meeting hall on one of the upper floors. There are wells reaching down to underground water sources, deep enough that if the city was ever sealed off from the surface, the people inside could survive without ever going up. Then there's the ventilation. More than 50 vertical shafts run through the city, some of them extending over 200 feet from the deepest level to the surface. These shafts weren't just for air. Researchers have found that they were positioned and angled in a way that created consistent airflow through all 18 levels, even at the very bottom of the structure, deep enough that natural air circulation should have been minimal. Modern engineers who have studied the shaft placement have noted that the system shows an understanding of pressure and airflow that wouldn't look out of place in a modern mining operation. This was supposedly built by hand, in an era with no advanced surveying tools, no artificial lighting beyond oil lamps, and no machinery. Then there are the doors. At several points in the city, the tunnels are sealed by massive circular stone doors, each one estimated to weigh somewhere between 1.5 and 500 kilograms, depending on the level. These stone discs could only be rolled into place or rolled away from the inside. There was no way to open them from the outer tunnel. If you were trying to get in and the people inside didn't want you there, you simply couldn't get in. Some of these doors are positioned at choke points, specifically designed so that only one person at a time could approach them. A defensive design that suggests the builders weren't just digging for storage, they were digging to survive an attack. So who built it and when? This is where the story gets murky, because the honest answer is nobody knows for certain. The most commonly cited theory credits the Phrygians, an ancient civilization that controlled their region around the 8th century BCE. The idea is that the Phrygians began the earliest tunnels, and that the city was expanded over hundreds of years by whoever occupied the region afterward, the Persians, then later Christian communities during the Byzantine era. But that timeline has problems. Some geologists who have studied the wear patterns and the tool marks on the oldest sections argue that portions of the tunnel network look significantly older than the 8th century BCE, potentially by thousands of years. The issue is that carved rock is notoriously difficult to date. Unlike organic material, you can't run carbon dating on stone that's been shaped by hand. All you can do is date objects found inside the tunnels, which only tells you when people were last using a space, not when it was first carved. This is the gap where a lot of the more unconventional theories creep in. A small number of researchers have pointed to the sheer scale and precision of the network and asked an uncomfortable question. What if some sections of Derinkuyu are far older than any recorded civilization in the region, built by a culture that left no other trace above ground, because whatever forced them underground also erased them from the surface record entirely? It's a theory that sits well outside mainstream archaeology, and most experts reject it, but it persists, in part because no one has ever found a satisfying explanation for why a Bronze Age or Iron Age society would need a defensive structure on this scale in the first place. because that's really the core mystery. Derinkuyu isn't just a basement, it's a fortress. And fortresses are built by people who are afraid of something specific. The leading theory is invasion. Cappadocia sat on a route that saw wave after wave of conflict. Persian expansion, the campaigns of Alexander the Great's successors, Roman control, and later, during the 7th through 10th centuries, repeated Arab raids into Byzantine territory. Historical records from the Byzantine period do mention Christian communities in Cappadocia using underground refuges to hide from raiding parties, sometimes for extended periods. Written sources describe communities disappearing underground for days or weeks at a time, sealing the stone doors, and waiting out the danger above. Byzantine chronicles from the 7th through 10th centuries occasionally reference Christian communities in Cappadocia vanishing underground when word reached them that a raiding party was approaching. These accounts describe villages that would appear completely empty to raiders passing through, no livestock in the fields, no smoke from chimneys, no sign of life at all, because the entire population, along with their animals and stored food, had already moved below ground and sealed the stone doors behind them. Some accounts describe these disappearances lasting not just days but weeks, with the surface remaining eerily abandoned until the danger had fully passed and scouts confirmed it was safe to return. Imagine being a soldier on one of those raids, riding through village after village that looked freshly lived in, bread ovens still faintly warm, tools left mid-task, yet finding not a single person anywhere. No amount of searching the surface would reveal where they'd gone, because the entrances were disguised as ordinary features of the landscape. A hole behind a haystack, a gap inside a stable, a crack in a hillside that looked like nothing more than weathering. Unless you already knew exactly where to look and exactly how to move the stone door blocking the way, the underground city was invisible. That part fits. What's harder to explain is scale. A refuge built to survive a raid for a few days doesn't usually need stables, wine presses, and dedicated ventilation engineering sufficient to support 20,000 people indefinitely. That level of infrastructure suggests something closer to a permanent parallel city, one designed not just to hide from a raid, but to actually live in, potentially for months, if the surface became unlivable or too dangerous to return to. And that raises the question nobody can fully answer. What happened above ground that made an entire underground society start to look like a long-term plan rather than a short-term shelter? Some researchers have pointed to climate and geological instability in the region across multiple historical periods. Earthquakes, volcanic activity from nearby dormant systems, and shifting water tables. It's possible that Derinkuyu wasn't only a response to human threats, but also to environmental ones the surface-dwelling population had experienced firsthand and didn't want to risk again. There's also the connection to Kamakla, a separate underground city roughly 5.5 miles away. Kamakla has its own multiple levels, its own ventilation shafts, its own stone doors, and evidence of a tunnel system that may have once linked the two cities directly underground. If that connection is real, and some surveys suggest it may be, then Derinkuyu wasn't an isolated bunker. It may have been one node in a much larger underground network stretching across the region, potentially connecting dozens of underground settlements that have never been fully surveyed, because most of Cappadocia's underground network remains unexcavated to this day. Local estimates suggest as few as half of the known underground settlements in the region have been opened to the public or fully studied. The rest remain sealed, collapsed, or simply unexplored, because the cost and danger of excavating unstable volcanic rock tunnels is enormous, which means, statistically, there's more of this network still underground and undiscovered than what we've already found. Let's talk about daily life inside, because this is where the story stops being abstract and starts being human. Based on the layout, researchers believe the upper levels were used for short-term shelter and storage, grain, animals, oil. The middle levels held communal living space, kitchens, meeting rooms, and what may have been classrooms. The lower levels, the coldest and most defensible, are believed to have served as long-term refuge space, including the chapel and what some believe may have been a small underground prison or isolation chamber, based on the design of one particularly small carved room sealed by its own stone door. Smoke from cooking fires had to be managed carefully in a sealed underground environment, which is likely why the kitchens are positioned deep within the network, far from the main living quarters, with their own dedicated ventilation shafts to avoid poisoning the air throughout the rest of the city. This alone tells us something important. Whoever engineered this space understood air circulation well enough to isolate a smoke source from a population living just a few dozen meters away, using nothing but angled shafts and airflow. There was no trial and error room for mistakes. If the ventilation had failed, entire levels could have suffocated in hours. And they built it anyway, apparently confident enough in the design to trust it with tens of thousands of lives. There's one more detail that historians keep returning to. Despite everything found inside, the stables, the wine presses, the schools, the chapels, there is remarkably little in the way of decoration. No elaborate carvings celebrating rulers. No inscriptions naming who built it or why. In a world where ancient civilizations regularly left behind monuments, temples, and inscriptions boasting of their achievements, Derinkuyu is almost eerily silent about itself. Whoever built this either didn't have the time for ornamentation, didn't feel the need for it, or deliberately avoided leaving any record that could identify them to whoever might one day find the city after they were gone. For a structure this massive, that silence is almost louder than any inscription would have been. Let's go back to the discovery itself for a moment, because the details matter more than most people realize. When that homeowner in 1963 broke through his basement wall, he didn't find a small crawl space. He found the beginning of a network so large that it took archaeological teams years just to map the sections considered safe enough to enter. Some tunnels were so narrow that researchers had to crawl on their hands and knees for dozens of meters before a passage opened back up into a full room. Other sections had partially collapsed over the centuries, forcing survey teams to reroute around unstable ceilings rather than risk digging through them. Even now, more than 60 years after the discovery, only a fraction of Derinkuyu is open to the public. The rest is either too unstable to enter safely, or simply hasn't been excavated yet, because clearing volcanic tuff by hand, carefully enough not to collapse a 2,000-year-old ceiling, is slow, expensive, and dangerous work. That's an important detail people forget. We are not looking at the complete picture. We're looking at maybe half of it, at best. Every excavation team that has worked on Derinkuyu since 1963 has reported the same frustration. The site keeps growing the longer they study it. A wall that looked solid turns out to be hollow behind it. A dead-end corridor turns out to have a hidden low passage at floor level, easy to miss unless you're specifically looking for it. Researchers have compared the experience to peeling back layers of an onion that seemingly has no center. Every answer just reveals another question. And every sealed room they finally open tends to lead to at least one more they hadn't known existed. And Derinkuyu isn't even the only one of its kind in the region. Beyond Kaymakla, smaller underground settlements have been identified at Özkunak, Maza, and Tatlarin, each with their own ventilation shafts, their own stone doors, their own defensive choke points. Some of these sites are separated from Derinkuyu by several miles of surface distance, yet show design features so similar that researchers believe they weren't built independently. Either the same group of engineers worked across multiple sites over generations, passing down the same techniques, or these communities were in close enough contact to share a common architectural playbook for building underground. If that's true, this wasn't a single city hiding from a single threat. It was a regional strategy. An entire population, spread across dozens of settlements that had collectively decided the safest place to live was beneath the ground rather than on top of it. Now let's talk about the water systems, because this detail alone tells us how seriously the builders took the possibility of a long siege. Derinkuyu's wells were deliberately designed so that they could not be accessed from ground level, only from inside the underground city itself. This wasn't an accident. If an enemy force controlled the surface, they could not poison or block the city's water supply, because there was no above-ground well opening for them to find. Some of these wells descend far below even the lowest inhabited level of the city, tapping directly into underground aquifers. Combined with the storage rooms for grain, olive oil, and wine, the entire structure reads less like an emergency shelter and more like a self-sufficient survival system, built by people who expected at some point to be completely cut off from the outside world, possibly for a very long time. Compare that to almost any other historical underground refugee we know of, and the difference in scale becomes obvious. Most defensive tunnel systems throughout history were built as short-term escape routes or storage, enough to survive a single raid, then return to the surface once the danger passed. Derinkuyu was built to survive an extended siege with a population in the tens of thousands indefinitely, using only what was already stored or grown underground. That is an entirely different category of engineering ambition. There's also something worth mentioning about how the stone doors were used strategically, not just structurally. Several of the largest circular doors are positioned not at the main entrances, but at intersections deep within the tunnel network, meaning that even if an intruder somehow got past the outer defenses, they would still run into a second, third, or even fourth sealed barrier before reaching the inhabited levels. Each of these doors could only be moved from the inner side, and each one was placed at a point narrow enough that only a single person could approach it at a time. In a worst-case scenario, a handful of defenders positioned at one of these choke points could hold off a much larger force indefinitely, simply because there was no way to attack more than one person at once in those cramped corridors. This is layered defense-in-depth design, the kind of strategic thinking we usually associate with fortified castles and military architecture. Except here, it was carved directly into volcanic rock, underground, by a population that left no written explanation of how they learned to think this way. And that brings us back to the uncomfortable question we raised earlier. How much of what we're seeing was actually planned from the very beginning, versus how much was expanded gradually, crisis by crisis, over hundreds of years? Because if even a portion of Derinkuyu's most sophisticated features, the ventilation shaft placement, the tiered defensive doors, the isolated water access, existed in its earliest form, that would suggest a level of forward planning that goes far beyond, let's dig a hiding spot and see what happens. It would suggest the earliest builders already understood, in detail, exactly what kind of extended threat they were preparing for. We don't have an answer for that. Nobody does. And that unanswered question is exactly why Derinkuyu keeps pulling researchers back, generation after generation, each hoping the next excavated tunnel will finally explain what the first one couldn't. So here's where the two competing theories separate. The mainstream explanation is patient, practical, and fits most of the evidence. Over roughly 2,000 years, multiple civilizations, Phrygians, later Christian communities under Byzantine rule, and possibly others in between, expanded a modest set of tunnels into an enormous multi-level refuge, driven by real, documented threats of invasion, raids, and instability across centuries. Under this theory, Derinkuyu isn't one mystery. It's the accumulated work of many different groups of frightened, resourceful people, each adding their own layer to a shelter that eventually became a small, buried civilization. The second theory is far less accepted, but it won't fully go away, because the evidence for exactly how old the deepest sections truly are remains incomplete. It suggests that some portion of this network predates the recorded history of the region entirely, carved by a group we have no other trace of, for reasons connected to some catastrophe that pushed them underground long enough that survival, not decoration, became their only priority. Under this theory, the later civilizations who occupied Cappadocia didn't build Derinkuyu. They found it, already carved, already ventilated, already defensible, and simply moved in. We may never know for certain which explanation is closer to the truth, because the deepest levels of Derinkuyu and the majority of Cappadocia's wider underground network remain unexcavated. Every few years, a farmer renovating a basement or a construction crew widening a road breaks through into another sealed tunnel that had been sitting undisturbed for who knows how long. Each discovery reshapes what we think we know about the scale of what's really down there. What makes this harder to resolve is that both theories can technically coexist. It's entirely possible that an earlier, smaller network was carved by one of the ancient civilizations we already know about, the Phrygians most likely, and that this original core was later discovered, reoccupied, and dramatically expanded by Christian communities centuries afterward, each generation adding new levels, new ventilation shafts, and new defensive doors as their own threats evolved. Under that version of events, there isn't one mystery to solve. There are layers of mystery stacked on top of each other, each belonging to a different century, a different fear, and a different group of people who never spoke to one another, connected only by the tunnels they left behind. That would also explain the strange inconsistency researchers have noted between different sections of the city. Some areas show cruder, simpler carving, while others, often deeper down, show far more refined and deliberate engineering. If the city was built in one continuous phase by one group, you'd expect the skill level to be roughly consistent throughout. Instead, it looks patchworked, as if built by different hands with different priorities, separated by long stretches of time in which the tunnels sat unused before someone new found them and continued digging. And that detail alone is enough to keep this from ever being a fully closed case. Every time researchers think they've settled on a timeline, a newly excavated section shows tool marks or a design choice that doesn't quite fit the pattern, and the debate opens back up again. What we do know is this: somewhere beneath the villages of Cappadocia, there is almost certainly more tunnel network still sealed in the dark, waiting for the next wall to be knocked down by accident. Local officials in the region have said openly that they expect more entrances to be found in the coming years, simply because new construction keeps stumbling into passages that don't appear on any existing map. Every single one of those discoveries has the potential to either confirm the mainstream timeline or complicate it even further. Today, only a portion of Derinkuyu is open to tourists, carefully lit and reinforced for public safety. Walking through it now, most visitors experience maybe a fifth of what actually exists beneath their feet. The deeper levels remain closed, some for structural safety, some because they simply haven't been cleared yet. Guides on site will tell you, if you ask, that new sections are still being surveyed every year, and that nobody currently working on the site believes the mapping is anywhere close to finished. So we want to ask you directly: do you think Derinkuyu was built purely out of fear of other people, fear of the earth itself, or something else we haven't fully considered? Do you believe the deepest, oldest sections really do predate the civilizations we credit for the rest of it? Leave your theory in the comments below. We read every single one, and some of the best leads for future episodes have come directly from viewers who noticed a detail we missed. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind that isn't fully explained and isn't fully finished, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're going even deeper into a discovery that made archaeologists question everything they thought they knew about who came before us. Until then, stay curious, and don't stop asking what else might still be sealed beneath our feet.